Welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your day or your evening, depending on where you are zooming in from, to join us. This is an exciting session for us. This is the first session of our 2025 series on disasters. And we are incredibly grateful to have Judith Kulig with us today to kick off the series with defining and understanding disasters and what it means for rural nurses. Before we get started today, just a few brief housekeeping for our webinar. We are going to be accepting Q&A at any time if you want to drop that in either the chat or the Q&A panel on your Zoom bar. We are going to make sure that there's time for questions and answers towards the end. However, if you have a question specific to what Judith is speaking with at that moment, we do invite you to raise your hand and we will unmute you during the course of the session so you can ask that question as it's related to that particular piece of the presentation. So that way we can make this a little interactive if there's questions that can't wait until the end. So go ahead and feel free to do that. We'll be keeping our eyes out for you. Also, before we get started, just a very brief note. If you have been watching what we're doing here at GRNEN, we are in the final week of our application period for the Global Rural Nursing Virtual Collaboration Learning Grant. So if that's something that's been on your mind, please keep in mind that it is going to be open until next Monday. And you can just email us if you have any questions or if there's anything that we can do. Our next session will be next month in the beginning of July, so you can visit our website for that information as well. As we get started, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Judith Kulig. Over her 25-year academic career, she is focused on research on rural health issues, including rural nursing practice, understanding cultural groups who live in rural areas, and resilience in rural communities that experienced wildfires. She was the co-editor of the North American section of Rural and Remote Health Online Journal. Judith distributed her research findings through numerous publications and presentations accessed by community members, decision makers, research, and the media. So with that, I am going to stop my share so I can allow Judith to pull up her presentation. Thank you. So glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. I was very pleased to be invited. I'm happy to be here. I will just get my presentation up here. Okay, share. And go like that. There we go. Okay, great. Well, hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to be doing this presentation. You know, when I had the opportunity to study disasters and the role of nurses in disasters and so on, it was just a great research program. So I'm always pleased to be able to share the information with others. So what is our plan for today? Well, as you can see on the screen, we're going to talk about what are disasters, what are those formal definitions, and what is the data, and how does the data compare today from even 20 years ago? And importantly for those in the room, what is the role of rural nurses in preparing but also responding to disasters? And it's exciting that the ICN has updated their framework of disaster nursing competencies, so we will talk about those as well. And was already mentioned, please feel free to stop and ask questions along the way, raise your hand, put it in chat, or what have you. So I was really fortunate that I began to do research on disasters, particularly wildfires, at a time when people had not studied them before. And these are the four studies that we did. We started with a small research team at the Lost Creek Fire first, and it led to these other disasters that were going on, just really extensive disasters. So the McClure Fire, which is in the central part of British Columbia, basically almost decimated an entire community, including losing its main source of employment, which was a lumber mill. The Mallard Fire was in northern Saskatchewan in a little town called Lethbridge. And I'm sorry to say that as I'm sitting here, the Lethbridge residents are once again evacuating. There was a huge, massive wildfire in northern Saskatchewan. So once again, those people are leaving that town. And Slave Lake is the first community in our province and our country that literally burned down almost entirely. A good 60% of it burnt from a massive wildfire. So we had the good fortune as a team, including urban geographer, sociologists, epidemiologists, psychologists, to really begin to understand the impact of wildfires on human existence and what was happening. And so from that, being a nurse, we were able to extend that to say, like, what does this mean for rural nursing? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I was getting ready for this presentation and I thought would it be interesting to see what I could find in a few minutes from news headings. So on Saturday morning, I just spent 5 minutes and within that short time, I came up with these 4 news headings that are out there right now. The flooding in Australia, which has been very severe for not just the first time in the last few years. The Spanish weather, they're predicting 40-degree heat blasts in the next few weeks. They had such bad wind gusts in northern part of Alberta that they had to put out an extreme weather alert, and it closed a major airport. And of course, it fuels the wildfires that are going on in that part of the province. And in addition, this was just from the other day that there was these people being evacuated in northern Saskatchewan, and now more than that have been evacuated. So the reality is that these disasters are occurring at a very steady pace in a whole variety of areas in my country, and certainly I'm sure in your country as well. I think this all behooves us to understand this whole notion of this era that they're talking about now, which is the Anthropocene era, which is when we acknowledge and show that there is a significant human influence on the earth, which causes disruptions in our environment. And this, of course, is linked to climate change and disasters, which we will talk about throughout the presentation. We know, for example, that in the 1970s in my country, the average cost for a weather-related disaster was $8.3 million. But now that has gone up to $112 million between 2010 and 2019. That's a huge cost to insurance companies, to our societies, to our lives that is going on. So the first thing is, what are disasters? There is such a range of them, and there's such a range of how they get started. So let's make sure we're all on the same page as to what is a disaster. So most authors, most organizations that focus on disasters talk about them as a serious disruption to the functioning of a community. It topples over their infrastructure, their resources, and their ability to cope with everyday life in that community. It goes beyond the capacity to cope. And so that is just a straightforward basic definition. As we can all agree, I believe, in rural areas, it's even worse because in rural areas, we have fewer resources, we have less infrastructure, we have more vulnerability among the population, and we have more limited personnel, simply for a lot of reasons, because it's harder to recruit and retain people and so on. So when a disaster strikes a rural area, it's even worse. So disasters are due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. So it's really giving us hints already as to the role of rural nurses. When it's talking about vulnerability and capacity, rural nurses know who are the most vulnerable in their communities. Rural nurses know the capacity level of a community. So it talks really about community assessments, knowing your community, and strengthening that community so it can be ready for anything. Causes of disaster are threefold, natural, man-made, or technological or industrial hazards. There's such a range of disasters that are out there. A natural one, of course, is things such as the volcanic eruptions. If you've watched the news in the last few days, you can see the Mount Etna explosions and the tourists that were running from it. What's been happening in Iceland, those kind of things. The earthquakes that are occurring in Idaho and people wondering what that is going to lead to, if anything. There are also man-made disasters. Oil spills, dam failures are certainly some of them. And technological hazards include things such as terrorism and nuclear threats. It's important to recognize that the frequency, the complexity, and the severity of their impacts of these disasters are likely to increase in the future because of climate change, displacement, conflict, rapid and unplanned urbanization, technological hazards, and public health emergencies. And we can certainly think of public health emergencies such as COVID and what we all went through as a global society. In my part of the world, we have a problem with measles. I know there's measles in Texas and it's spread from there, but in my country, it's been in Ontario, New Brunswick, and where I live in southern Alberta. There is a very high, we have the highest rate right now of measles in the country. It's the highest rate since about the 1980s, so a significant period of time. But all in all, people will tell you that climate change is our greatest threat, and that more disasters and more intense ones are occurring as climate change progresses. So let's take a look at some examples. Well, we know that climate change has an effect on us physically, mentally, and our community's health. We know that there is an increase in heat-related episodes, for example, a rise in allergies. There's more waterborne diseases. And mentally, people talk about eco-anxiety and the very high levels of eco-anxiety among youth. And it may be something you've had to deal with in your own communities. There's stress, there's anxiety, there's substance abuse, post-traumatic stress, all of these things occur. And from a community health perspective, there are certainly people that believe that the increase in interpersonal aggression can be partly related to the climate change experience, as well as the increase of violence and crime, social instability, and there's a reduction of social cohesion. Let's take a look at the occurrence of disasters. And this organization, I'm just going to read out what the acronym stands for. So it's CRED, but it's the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters. And the references are all at the end of the presentation. But let's look at this interesting graphic. They break it down by the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia. So you can see right away, excuse me, that Asia are 167 disasters by continent and the top 10 countries in 2024. So that's a phenomenal amount of disasters. And then you'll see there that Indonesia had 20, China had 18, and so forth. And then there's Africa, where you have 75 disasters for that area of the world. Europe has 24, and the Americas, including South America, Latin America, Central America, US, and Canada, 118 disasters. So that's a lot of disasters in 1 year. Think of the resources that are needed, the people that are needed, the kind of destruction that occurs, the houses that have to be rebuilt, the businesses that are lost. So this is really a phenomenal number and what this means. Then there's the human impact. So these percentages are the proportion of affected by continent in 2024. So Asia had 67.7% impacted from disasters in 2024. The Americas, 7.3, Europe, 0.3, Africa, 24.6, and Oceania, 0.1. So again, you can see the large number of people that are impacted and where in the world. And when you think about where in the world, Think about the resources that are there. And if you are a rural nurse or remote nurse in that area, what did it mean for your workload in the last year? The kind of things that you had to attend to, which needed to be done immediately, and what could be different, what you could have done differently, or the work you could have accomplished if you had had a chance to do it without having that disaster. I'm just gonna check and see if there was any questions in the, I see there was some, Stacy, in the chat box, there's 3.
Yes, a lot of people are just saying hello, and then one individual did say that they hope by the end of the presentation you'll share with us. So I'm assuming that you mean the statistics or that might be shared. If that's not correct, please let me know. But just so everyone on the call is aware, we are recording this session and we will make this available by the end of the week on our website. So you can go back to the presentation and you can look at it and you can see all the statistics that are being shared today. If that doesn't help or if that's not your question, please feel free to clarify. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for clarifying that, Stacy. Okay, so we talked about the numbers of disasters, we've talked about the human impact. Let's talk about what are the most common disasters that are out there. And again, this is a 2024, but it's comparing it to the 2004 to 2023 annual average. So you can see there, right here, that it is more often floods has been the one that has been the most common disasters that are out there. And we can all easily think back just in the last 6 months, the kind of floods that we've heard about. Floods right now in Australia, there's been floods in Europe and so on. Storms, meaning a whole variety of kinds of storms, in terms of cyclones, tornadoes, things like that, is the next highest. It's talking about mass movements, whether they're wet or dry. Interesting way to talk about it, earthquakes and wildfire. And so it's interesting when you look at these on a global perspective, because certainly if we remember back a few months ago to when Los Angeles was experiencing the fires that they were having there and the number of houses that were destroyed and the people's lives that were lost, it is really phenomenal for that state and that country. But when you look at it from a world perspective, it is not quite as large. Okay, so disaster events in the United States for 2024, there were 27 confirmed weather or climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion. And if you have home insurance in the US, I'm assuming that you've experienced what we've experienced here, which is an increase in your home insurance. So this kind of change goes right to your own personal pocketbook. So the average number of events, disaster events, was 9 between 1980 and 2024. But in the last 5 years, 2020 to 2024, the average number was 23. It's just staggering, isn't it, to go from 9 to 23. Huge difference. And those kind of events that occurred last year of the 27 was flooding, storm events, cyclone events, wildfires, winter storm events. So again, very much so, disasters are occurring more on a regular basis and affecting more people more intensely. I really like this graphic, and you will see there where these events have occurred. And they talk about things like Tornado Alley, for example, and the part of the United States where those storms tend to be, where the winter storms are, of course, where severe, hailstorms are, and so on, wildfires, etc. So again, it shows you a particular area where it's very common. And then if you're a rural or remote nurse in those areas, again, you know what could happen to you and what you have to respond to. And that's a good thing to know that, because then you can be prepared for that. Now, in my own country, for disasters in Canada in 2024, there was the highest total insured loss in our history, which was more than $7 billion. One of those fires alone was, or one of those events alone was a wildfire in the mountain community of Jasper, which is in a national park. And the cost is $880 million, and a good half to 2/3 of the community burnt down. And so now they're having to rebuild, and the amount of time that that will take to do that. And in addition, of course, there were floods and hurricanes. So we know that in my country that Canada is warming twice as much as the global national average or global average. In 2023, we saw our most destructive wildfire season. And that year, the wildfires consumed 16.5 million hectares of land. That's an awful lot of land, which is more than double the previous record and 7 times more than the historical average. And as I mentioned earlier, right now we have a lot of wildfires going on. When I started studying wildfires, the wildfire season did not officially begin until the beginning of May 1st. It now begins routinely every year, March 1st. So having a wildfire season start 2 months early is very significant. You shouldn't have wildfires of that intensity that early in the season. But right now, northeastern British Columbia, the northern half of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Newfoundland are on fire. And we are now asking for assistance from the United States, but also it's very common for the Australian firefighters to come, as well as firefighters from South Africa and so on. Our smoke from those fires has now traveled 7,000 kilometers to Europe. So people in the Mediterranean were already having our wildfire smoke in the middle of May, and now it's a much larger area of Europe. So the disaster itself is not just about the location, but where things get you. So that smoke means that it's hazardous for people's health in Europe and the Mediterranean. So again, another interesting implication of disasters and what happens. Is there any questions or anything I can answer now before we move into disaster phases?
It looks like we're okay to proceed.
Okay, great. So this is a very simplistic diagram, but sometimes simple works best. And that is that, you have this thing called a disaster right up here, and you have people responding to that, recovering and so on. But of course, where we really want nurses to be involved with is over here in preparedness and mitigation, so that when the disaster occurs, it's not as severe. And so then our response is more realistic, and that we can be very much prepared to deal with the recovery, which could be short-term or long-term. All nurses have a role, and Brewer did a scoping review of nurses, rural nurses and disasters. And she talked about in that we have focused on nurses, rural nurses having a role in the response phase to the disaster. Triage, emergency services, critical care, operative services, and public health. But the question is, what are the roles of rural nurses in other parts related to disasters? And is there anything unique about rural nurses and disasters? Well, let's find out. Brewer also found out that the generalist role of a rural nurse fits really well, because in that generalist role of rural and remote nurses, they are very good at doing assessment of clients, and I say also and community. It isn't just the individual clients, but the full community, providing first aid, giving psychological support, and working in collaboration with other agencies. And these are absolutely essential skills. Our first study, when we looked at rural nurses and so on came to wildfires, we focused on the unique knowledge that they have of communities and its residents, that rural nurses can contribute to local policy, development in relationship to disasters, that rural nurses are there for the long-term recovery phase, including mental health issues, that rural nurses understand group dynamics and how to deal with them in recovery. So rural nurses are really good at understanding the cycles of a community. If it's a farming community, is it in harvest or is it in seeding? What's going on there, and what impact does that have on disasters? Rural nurses know who needs assistance with evacuation. Those are the vulnerable, those that may not have vehicles. In the Barrier, BC, where the McClure fire occurred, excuse me, one of the outcomes was to have a contract with the local school division so that they could use the school buses to transport people that needed to be evacuated. So, for example, senior citizens in some kind of lodge facility may not be driving anymore, but the school bus could get them to the next town in a much safer way. That was just one example. The unfortunate thing about disasters is that it can bring people close together and they can feel tight and work together and so on. But disasters can often divide communities. And I know we saw a number of examples during the research where people felt like, um, regardless of whether or not you were wealthy or not wealthy or average or whatever, everybody had the same access to funds to then rebuild their home or what have you. But for some people, they felt like those that had enough money shouldn't apply for some of the funding. So there was those kind of issues that went on as well. And so rural nurses are really familiar with those challenges and what's going out there and developing methods to deal with them. So that's another positive thing about rural nurses. When we did our national study of rural nurses, the second one, we added in a question about rural nurses' roles in disasters. We wanted to know if they were resilient and also what did they do. So the rural nurses that we examined their responses, and they talked a lot about the pre-disaster preparation was so important. They had to know this community. They had to know what the resources were there. They needed to know the vulnerable and so on. Nurses who were more remote in their location as a nurse had a much greater experience with disasters because it was them. There was nobody else really to help deal with that. And that disaster could be a school bus crash in winter conditions that has to be dealt with. It could be unusual, other kind of weather patterns that they had to deal with. And also that nurses in both remote and rural areas have decreased access to resources. They simply do not have the same kind of opportunities to access resources that other nurses do, and they become their own resource and they figure it out on their own. Going back to Brewer, they also found out that when a pending disaster was coming, because sometimes you have some timeline that you know what is coming, they can locate equipment that they would need, communicate that the disaster is imminent, find disaster maps, and continually assess and reassess what needs to be done. The one positive thing is that the society as a whole has become better at creating useful apps such as emergency alert apps that let you know what is coming your way and how to deal with that. So that's one positive thing that people can be involved in. Community involvement, as I've said a number of times, is just really essential. It's essential to be engaged with the community, have a good working relationship with them, know the local policymakers. Is there a local disaster committee that's beyond your work setting? So is it beyond the hospital or public health setting? Does it involve community members? So does it involve the first responders? And does it involve perhaps religious clergy or what have you? Etc., those kind of things. And in addition, Brewer found that nurses could manage this situation because of the support that they had and the supplies that were provided to the affected community. They knew how they could attend to this disaster in a most positive way for the community. We know that rural nurses are respected leaders, have sound voices, understand the local context, and can communicate effectively with vulnerable community members. And Wilson really emphasizes that engaging primary care providers, such as rural nurses in disaster management, is critical for long-term recovery and resilience. I can't say it enough that rural nurses are just so key for dealing with that disaster, getting ready for the disaster, dealing with it and dealing with the recovery. Such a major, major key part of that community. There's other roles that nurses have in disasters. They can help in preventing, responding to, and helping communities recover from disasters, as we've said. But in addition, there's the whole usefulness of working with the ICN document on competencies. And that's what we'll talk about next. But I just want to emphasize again, I think I've said it a few times, but we know that nurses are still the largest group of health providers. So when it comes to dealing with disasters, they are the ones that are keen and available and in larger number to work it out. And we also know, and we'll return to this at the end of the presentation, that there are so many changes in our physical world that it illustrates that nurses had to be prepared for a range of disasters and for a higher frequency and intensity of disasters. So let's talk about the ICN and the competencies that they put together. So in 2009, the ICN and the World Health Organization published the first framework of nursing disaster competencies. And we use that as a framework in our article on rural nurses and wildfires. So it was recognized that there was this urgent need to prepare nurses to respond to the range and frequency of disasters. So they set out again to make their updated version of those competencies, and that was published in 2019. What's different about this document is that they have become more complex and complicated in presenting it and developing it. So first of all, the competencies apply to 3 levels of nurses. Level 1, any nurse who's completed a basic nursing education program and is registered. Level 2, any nurse who's achieved level 1 and aspires to be a designated disaster responder. And level 3, any nurse who has reached level 1 and 2 competencies and is prepared to respond to a variety of emergencies. So in the first level, it's often we're referring to staff nurses and those in public health. In level 2, it's those that are in leadership. So they're organizing disaster plans. They may be a preparedness or response nurse educator. And level 3 often refers to military nurses who are those that are frequent responders to international disasters. Let's say they might go with the Red Cross to someplace. And nurses who are conducting comprehensive disaster research. So the ICN is saying, we've got this document, we've got these level of nurses. They've done a lot of work on developing level 1 and 2, but they need to further the development of level 3. And maybe that's something that is interesting to you. So each competency, which is common in competencies, of course, is that it's an individual measure of applied skills and knowledge that enable people to perform work. So we need to have an action verb, a content, and a context. So that the action verb needs to be observable or measurable. The content is the subject matter, the type and performance, or the specific task. And the context is the limitations or the conditions of the work environment. So what we're going to do in the next couple slides is look at a couple of the competencies that were developed. So in this one, you'll see that I have circled domain number 5, this one right here, which is assessment, that nurses level 1 and certainly level 2, but mostly level 1, are responsible to gather data about assigned patients, families, communities on which to base subsequent nursing actions. So they're talking about, let's do this pre-disaster assessment of the people in this community and the community as a whole to find out what can we create in terms of getting ready for a disaster. And the other domain that I focused on is recovery. So any steps taken to facilitate the resumption of pre-event individual, family, community organization functioning or moving it to a higher level. So those are the ones that nurses really are focusing on. It's not that, no, I'm not saying they're not focusing on intervention, but let's get ready for that disaster. And okay, the disaster has occurred. How can we help them to recover? So more specifically, in this next one here on domain 5, the assessment, this section, the left side of your screen, is focusing on the general professional nurse. The left column is, and the right column is focusing on the advanced or specialized nurse and what they do. So what ICN did then was say, okay, if you're doing the assessment, report symptoms or events that might indicate the onset of an emergency in assigned patients, families, communities. So in this case, it might even be some kind of pandemic. So you've got the number 2 is performing rapid physical and mental health assessment, which is very important in terms of disasters. And then, of course, doing ongoing assessment of those, of that community, of those people in that evolving disaster event. And the next level then here too then is, because you're looking again at general nurses and advanced nurses, right? So the advanced nurses in column 2 are the right column. You've got leadership there that needs to assure that all nurses have up-to-date information on potential emergency events and the process for reporting them if observed. You need to have event-specific guidance on rapid, on rapid physical and mental health assessment. You need to be aware of disaster/emergency triage and all assessment courses that they're taught in basic and continuing education programs. And you need to identify event-specific vulnerable populations. So you can see very clearly, I believe, that this tells you what kind of training and education is required in basic nursing education, but also in addition in continuing education for those that have been completed their nursing education for some time. If we looked at recovery, again, you've got your general professional nurse on the left and the advanced or specialized nurse on the right. So in recovery, the focus, of course, is you want to resume functioning as a community and as people. So what can that general professional nurse do to assist an organization to maintain or resume functioning during and after the event? And what does that mean for patients and families and communities? What about referrals for ongoing physical and mental health needs? And what about the participation in transition debriefing to identify personal needs for ongoing assistance? One of the interesting groups of people that we uncovered when we did our disaster work in wildfires was ruminators. So ruminators are people that simply can't let go of the disaster event. They can't move forward and they get caught and they get stuck. And from a mental health perspective, that's really dangerous for them. They really need to have some assistance and help to move forward. In addition, the other thing we found during these disasters was, again, this is some statistics from the local policing organizations, was that there were always a few people that required the enactment of the Mental Health Act. So what I mean by that is, in my province and in my country, if somebody is displaying certain mental health symptoms, you can use the Mental Health Act to say they need to be in a secure, safe place so they don't harm themselves or others, because people simply couldn't cope with their losses and what they have done. So nursing has a big role in those parts as well. For the recovery for advanced nurses, you've got, again, a lot of leadership, communication, making sure people are responsible, that they know what they have to do and how to do it. And for the second one there is about maintaining up-to-date referral resource lists. For the events that I have been involved with, what would happen was the province would often add in additional professionals to assist in these kind of situations, whether that be psychologists or family counselors or what have you, but individuals who could help people move forward with their lives. So the ICN anticipates that these competencies will be adopted by nursing organizations. So my question is, can your organization, can GREN consider such an action? What could Grendu to make this look like rural aspects of disaster recovery and preparation and so on as well. That I think would be an exciting contribution to understanding disaster nursing roles. Now, I certainly have some concerns for rural nurses in general because it is very difficult to deal with these disasters. So you've got this blurring already. We already know rural nurses have a blurring of professional and personal roles. How do you deal with your own family when there is a disaster? What do you do? And Fort McMurray is another community in my province that a third to half it burnt in a fire, and being a consultant on a project related to that. But they had to evacuate the entire hospital. And one of the nurses there who was in a leadership position, and they had to keep going. Their responsibility was for that hospital and getting people out. And yes, they had families and they had kids and everything, and they had to figure that out as well. But once they did, this nurse that was in a leadership role had a nursing meeting and said to these nurses, we all going to put on our capes because today we are super nurses and we are going to do this. And it was just such a wonderful story. It kind of makes me teary because I think how challenging that was to evacuate that entire hospital when there are flames all around you and you've got elderly people on oxygen and everyone's scared and all that kind of stuff. It's an amazing thing what they did. So how do nurses cope with what is happening? And, in our the national study, we had more than one example of, a medevac plane leaving, crashing, losing the patient, losing the pilot, knowing the families, knowing the pilot, and how do you deal with all of that? And also caring for those that you know who are involved in that disaster. It's a very difficult thing to do. So it's really important that you have self-care as well to cope with what you had to deal with. On a personal level, make sure you've got your grab and go bag, your 72-hour bag, so it's ready and your family knows where it is and they can get it and leave, because you may be in a hospital or public health setting and not be able to go home at all. And what is your plan? Do you have a plan in place for your immediate family for addressing that disaster? And of course, we have to get ready for the future. As I said earlier, we had this Anthropocene era that we're in. It's not going away. This is our reality. So we need to think about our basic nursing education, rural nurses included. What do we need to include about climate change? And I mentioned eco-anxiety. And what about disasters and disaster nursing? What can we teach nurses about that? And those that are already out there working, what kind of continued education do we need to provide to them so that they're ready for disasters? There are some organizations, some nurses who talk about using practice disaster nursing scenarios with interprofessional collaboration that have been very successful. Okay, so there is my formal presentation. And as I mentioned, all of the references are here with the data and so on. And I know it's been recorded and it'll be shared in some way. So I hope that was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions or make any comments or hear people's comments or examples of working with disasters.
Thank you so much for that. That was incredibly moving and incredibly insightful. So please feel free to either drop a question or a comment, or even if you want to share something of your own experience in the chat, raise your hand if you'd like us to unmute you. We're going to keep that open for a couple minutes. So while you're kind of collecting your thoughts, I would be remiss not to share, and I'm putting this in the chat myself, that Judith was kind enough to be one of our first interviews a couple years ago when we did the world tour. If you haven't checked out that series, I've dropped it in the chat. we had a podcast series that interviewed individuals from 7 different countries. And she sat down with Samuel Mann, who was our interviewer, and talked a lot about her experiences, shared some insights on what it was like in Canada, to kind of give people the idea or the feel of what it's like to be a rural nurse in her part of the world for individuals who may not have the opportunity to travel there. And we did that with a few different countries just to kind of show how our similarities and how close we really are together. So we're grateful that we have her back to do this again, and for all of the experience and knowledge that you have just shared. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, you're
So
most.
if if anyone has any questions, also just another small plug. I know a lot of the things that you talked about too, Judith, that the impacts of disasters on rural nurses, and you touched on mental health, and you touched on resilience and coping and self-care for the nurses, and just the blurring of living and working in the community that you serve. And we have had a lot of discussions on those various topics too. So if any of those kind of touches you specifically from what was shared today, I also would recommend dropping into the archived webinars on our website, because there are a lot of different topics there that have been covered. And it's just so important for this field of nursing. It's very unique. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions right now, I'm not going to keep everyone. Thank you again for your time. Look to our website. Like by the end of the week, we will have this posted on the webinars, the on-demand webinar section. So you can go ahead and you can collect all of this information and share it with friends and colleagues who may not have been able to attend today. But again, thank you for your time, Judith. Thank you as always. We are so grateful for you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm glad to have had a chance to do it. Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone.
Okay, bye everyone.